everyone, it's Janice, host of the Divorcing Religion podcast. Thanks for tuning into my show, whether you're joining me on audio or video. I've heard from some folks recently who have told me just how much the show has meant, and some of them have even found it not only to be life-changing, but life-saving, as they felt there was no one else who understood what they were going through, and they found the Divorcing Religion podcast, and they started feeling encouraged. Please help me keep my show on the air. Become a member by clicking the join button on the Conference on Religious Trauma YouTube channel. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. My guest today is Rebekah J. Monroe, who identifies as a white queer woman with lineage in the Osage and Cherokee Tribes. Rebekah goes by the pronouns she, her, and they. Currently, Rebekah is a clinical psychology doctoral student, co-founder of the nonprofit NARC-RT, and that stands for North American Research Collective Religious Trauma, and vice chair on the Reclamation Collective Board of Directors. Rebekah's research interests include sexuality, sex education, cultural hegemony in institutions, health equity, mental health, yoga therapy, and religious trauma, with an intersectional Black feminist lens inspired by scholars like Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberlé Crenshaw, and bell hooks. Rebekah sees herself as a translational scholar, making space in social sciences for people who are looking for navigation in healing from institutional harm and religious trauma. She envisions herself directing a research community center specializing in holistic care after finishing her graduate studies while working as a clinician part-time. You are so busy. I can't believe you had time to join me today. Welcome, Rebekah. It's nice to see you.
I've been busy writing that, apparently, because the most, I know it's so academic, and I'm like proud, but also ashamed at the same time.
I think it's marvelous. We absolutely need people studying religious trauma. It's really only something that we've been discussing with the name religious trauma, like over the last 5 years, it feels like to me. So people previously have talked about spiritual abuse, spiritual trauma. And then, of course, Dr. Marlene Winnell is the one who coined the phrase religious trauma syndrome, just as referring to the collection of symptoms that some people experience with religious trauma. And one thing that you and I will be discussing is a definition of religious trauma. But first, I'd love to know a little bit about you and your background, your childhood. Was religion a thing for you and your family?
Yes. My parents actually bonded over the Bible in the Air Force. So, it's been since before my conception that it was going to be in my life. And my name is the Hebrew spelling because my parents picked all of their names out of the Bible for all my siblings. And so my middle name is Joy, so, fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And I was in church my entire childhood and adolescence. And it's funny, and I give a little background on my parents because parents tend to be relevant to our upbringing. So my dad grew up in Missouri, and a very small town. He grew up Jehovah's Witness, and he was one of 8 boys that my grandma had. And he was very poor, just severe poverty, 2 pairs of pants, one for school, one for the farm, definitely a lot of abuse, pretty severe, I would say, child abuse, and just went through a lot, and religion was just always part of his life. But I know that he converted to being Baptist in his younger adult life. And we also went to Methodist churches. So I just know that he identified as Christian, Protestant, not necessarily Jehovah's Witness in particular, but more, I guess, mainstream. And we I'm trying to think. Going back to my mom grew up on Long Island, New York. And
Yay.
I got the accent. I have like such a boring, like standard Midwestern accent. And I think it's funny because my dad has a bit of hillbilly and my mom has a bit of New York. And I'm just like, this is what happens when that meets, I guess. So my mom is really interesting because she didn't grow up religious as a kid, but then my Nana divorced and remarried to a pastor. And then she herself went to seminary, which she's in her late 80s. Wow. So that's pretty radical.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, like she told me she was stopped in like the grocery store by another woman, like shaming her because she had her collar on. And I'm like, okay, Nana be badass, you know, like Nana be doing the most. But it's interesting because my Nana's pretty liberal and my parents are quite conservative. And they live in Missouri. I don't know how that came out. But and then my mom's family is mostly from like Long Island area. And so his family is pretty much still in Missouri. And yeah, like my mom got more religious as she became a young adult, and then honestly way more conservative, and joined the military where she met my dad. He was like holding the Bible around and she thought that was like super hot. And I was like, okay. So, and it's cool because she was one of the few women avionic engineers. Like my mom's a badass too, but like she's also, I really do love my mom, but we've had difficulties, and I know she's done testimony on that. So I don't have any guilt about doing my own testimony because I know she does as well. If we're framing it in that way, right? Which I know she does. I don't necessarily frame it as testimony, but anyway, so like that's a little on my parents. And I was the youngest of three, born on an Air Force base in Florida. And we went to church since I can remember. And in Florida, in the Air Force Base, it was a bit more ethnically diverse. But what I think is interesting is because it's on a military base, I think there's like kind of the culture of just the military itself and military families. And I think that kind of like, of course, there were still ethnic cultural differences as well. But I think that almost kind of supersedes other things in some ways. In a way it doesn't in like non-military settings, if that makes sense. And so we ended up actually leaving Florida to go to Missouri. My dad had a gambling addiction and we went bankrupt. I don't think we had much money anyways, but what we did have, he gambled away, and my parents almost split up. But they ended up deciding to work on their marriage. And then I feel like that made them come even closer. And yeah, I feel like their marriage and their religion is what kind of saved their marriage and then themselves in a way. Like for my dad, he no longer gambles. And I think it's, I think he goes to like a gambling group similar to like Alcoholics Anonymous, but he does have small group, right? And like that's definitely his way of life. And I think that's kind of been how he's been able to recover. And I think my mom in different ways. So anyways, that's a little on my parents' background. And I, growing up, was always very skeptical. Just like, I don't know if I believe this. And I, said the prayer of, I'm giving myself to Christ. I want to be saved. I don't even know how many times, Janice, like, because I was so afraid to go to hell. And one of the memories that really stuck with me, and this was when I still lived in Florida, so I was younger than 6 years old. And I remember being in my dad's lap and like saying, children go to heaven, right? And he's like, yeah, because children are innocent. I'm like, can I just die as a kid then? Because then I'll definitely go to heaven.
Oh dear. That is so awful.
Isn't that really sad?
That's so sad. Oh my gosh.
I laugh as a way of coping. But yeah, no, it's really sad. And so I have this really visceral fear of hell. And I've had that since I was very young. And I will still have bouts of just like being so scared of death. And so that's stuck with me. And I would compulsively want to be saved because I was so scared of that. So that was a real like trauma response, I think, in experiencing this just over and over repetition of like, you're going to be burning in hell. You're a sinner. You're dirty, right? You are deviant. And that could mean having demons in me or the devil doing its work, like those were definitely phrases I heard. And I'm trying to think, like, I was super invested in church up until I left for college, which is, it's interesting because my parents were like, yes, you go to college. My mom more than my dad, because my dad's like, money, that's cost money, right? And we ended up taking out loans, didn't really have the financial literacy of understanding, at least myself, of what that meant. And I was studying music at the time, which is probably like one of the worst things to get a degree in terms of financial security. Music, we need it. It's so important, but like not the most secure and financially valued unless you make it rich, but 1%. So that's, that was where I was at. And that was what I was good at, is theater and singing and playing instruments. So that skill was developed in church, right? Yeah. To the point I learned to harmonize by ear when I was 11, and I joined the praise band that performed at the contemporary music service every Sunday morning. So we're not talking Wednesday night shit. We're talking Sunday morning. Yeah, that's shit. Right. I'm a headliner, right?
Big leagues.
Super big leagues. And I was the only child in the band regularly. And the rest were adult musicians. And I loved that experience. I really loved performing. I love harmonizing. I love music. Yeah. But, one of the drummers was super creepy and would like make comments about like, oh, you look hot or things like that. Like, oh yeah, no, absolutely weird, creepy shit. And so there was these experiences that I definitely encountered there and in my high school. And like, it's a small town in Missouri. It's called Lebanon, Lebanon. So yes, like Lebanon, but you would not say Lebanon. You say Lebanon. Okay. There's an apostrophe phonetically where the A is. Yeah. That's how you say it if you're Missouri. No, they just started construction again, of course.
That's okay. Can't hear it at all. No problem.
Okay, good. If let me know if it does become disruptive and I will run away and find somewhere else to be. No problem. So what was I saying? I was saying
you're in Lebanon.
Lebanon. So I was in Lebanon from second grade to my senior year of high school. And then my first year of college was at Central Methodist University, which is in Fayette, Missouri. And that was an interesting year. But like up until that, and this isn't something I really had understood until later years, that my high school principal, who was also very openly Christian, right, to the point of praying at our public high school graduation and being, touted for that. Like, wow, like he's such a good Christian and man
of God.
Such a man of God and so active in the community, always coming to events and stuff. Well, turns out he was grooming me. I didn't realize it at the time. And he definitely had groomed other students as well. And it didn't end up in sexual abuse because I was lucky that I had been empowered enough by my parents and my mom particularly. I'm going to give a lot of credit to her that I did have a strong personality, and she didn't, squash that. Because I saw other parents do that a lot more than mine did. And yes, my parents are conservative and we disagree on a lot of things, but they are not as conservative as a lot of families that did go to church, to the point where they were seen as like not conservative enough, which is just a really interesting reality. And like people like from Chicago are like, what? And I'm like, it's a different world. It's a different world. It's 98% white Republican, conservative Christian. Literally, it's the home of the WASPs.
Wow.
Anglo-Saxon Protestants, for those who don't know that acronym. Were you going to say something?
Wow. Well, I'm really grateful then to your mom for not working so hard to force you into a subservient, mousy, meek kind of mold, so that you were able to either provide pushback or recognize that something was not quite right with this principle, whatever you managed to avoid some of the issues that might have befallen other girls at the school.
No, and I think it's important to give that credit, despite my many qualms with being raised in the Christian church.
Right.
And a lot of that was purity culture. So that's what's interesting is like my mom, like I told you, there's a lineage of badass women. Mm-hmm. And even though my mom's conservative, she still is badass. And I think it's more of a matriarchal family. My dad can come at me, but I think that's probably pretty accurate in ways. Like there's some where they kind of fall into traditional gender roles, but I think she's very good at advocating. And so that did shine through for me, I think. But a lot of the experiences I had that I find were the most oppressive were almost always at the hands of white men that were in some type of authority position. And that was a youth pastor, that was a couple regular pastors, that was my high school principal. Primarily those were the worst. And they really came down to shaming me because I was a sexual being and am a sexual being. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to, I didn't have intercourse until I was 19. Right. Mm-hmm. Because if it's not that, if it's something else, that doesn't count.
Right.
As long as your hymen's intact. Right. Because that's all that matters.
Well, I know. Hymen worship. Yep.
Oh my. That's good. Even looks like him.
Yeah.
Huh. Or like HYMN, but also, that's, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but, so that was just, I definitely went up in front of crowds and signed a purity pledge.
Oh,
that definitely happened. It was strong. I had exposure to some of the books. I forget, was it
I Kissed Dating Goodbye?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. See, I purposefully have not been able to remember
it out. Yeah.
Honestly,
sorry about that.
People are like, don't you know this Bible verse? I'm like, you'd be surprised at how well I blocked stuff out. I am not a scholar of the Bible. I'm really more a scholar of the culture around Christianity and how that kind of intersects with white supremacy culture, rape culture, and purity culture, and then how that embodies itself within institutions. So that's kind of there's that sociology side of me that kind of informs the psychologist in me, which gets me in a lot of trouble in psychology spaces. But I like to say I've infiltrated psychology. Obviously, there's people doing amazing work already. I'm not the only person, I think, doing radical things. Of course not. There's been so much groundwork laid before me, but at the same time, a lot of work needs to be done.
So then at what point did you kind of extricate yourself from your parents' religious belief system? And how did that go?
Divorce religion, even.
Yeah. Yeah. How'd that happen?
So I think just being in college, and I was just so ready to be free of the expectations on me because of my cisgender, being a woman and being supposedly heterosexual, because that's what you needed to be. And I just stopped going to church, and I don't remember if I still identified as a Christian when I was 18 to 19. I probably still did, but I just stopped going to church and realized I really enjoyed not going. And then I'd finished my first year of college, and my brother had gotten married, and his best man, kind of creepy, not gonna lie, but he invited me to visit Chicago where he lived to just visit. And because I was singing jazz and wanted to sing jazz professionally at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to visit. Of course, he hadn't told his roommate that I was coming to visit. So that was really much awesome. And I was 19 and he's like in his early
Awkward.
30s. Super weird. It wasn't cool, but like and my mom wasn't thrilled, I'm pretty sure. But I was like, I'm doing this because I was just like, I just want to get out of here. I'm gonna do what I want. I'm gonna have sex if I want, whatever, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I didn't have very good sex education because it was so based in abstinence that I didn't really have the wherewithal to be that strong person in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Not as strong as I would have liked to have been. Because of the world we live in. And, but yeah, so I ended up going to Chicago just to visit. I had $300, my guitar, like a couple suitcases. And I was just like, I'm going to visit. We're going to see how this goes. And then I never went back to Missouri. I just told my school. I finished a year there. I got like a 3.9. I was studying vocal performance and theater. And I was like, yeah, I'm not going to come back. I'm going to stay in Chicago. They were pissed.
Yeah.
They were so pissed. And I was like, what? It's my life. It's
yeah,
life,
exactly.
you know? Okay, I'd be pissed. Yeah. And so I stayed, and my first apartment had bed bugs, and I got a job after a couple of weeks at a diner in Boys Town, which is the neighborhood in Chicago. One of them. There are others. Shout out to okay, now I can't even think of it. I'm ashamed of myself. Oh, Andersonville. That's the lesbian neighborhood. We need to give some kudos to other spaces. But anyways, so I worked in Lakeview, and it was literally, it was next to the Red Line, which is the Chicago Transit. And on the other side, there was it's called Berlin, and it was like a drag show bar lounge, just super cool. Yeah. And I ended up working at a restaurant next to this. And I say this because it's funny that just the culture shock that ensued when I first got there. I remember I was working at this grilled cheese pub and grub. I was 19, and I saw smoke coming under the wall. Oh. And I was like, is there a fire next door? Like, what is going on? And they were like, honey, that's the fog machine. And I was like, oh, which was like, I'm in the right place. I'm in the right place. I was like, I belong here. I'm like, fog machine. Fun. I'm like, put the lights on me. I'm ready. You know, like, I loved that. I loved that there was drag shows next door. I loved that there was so many different kinds of people. Yeah. And I loved
way more freedom.
I felt. Yeah. And so I ended up staying in Chicago for 9 years. And especially, I think, when I got to Chicago, and again, I wasn't going to church, and I just wasn't feeling as bad about myself. And I think there was just such an attachment to that feeling of less shame that I just fell in love with Chicago. And I went through a lot. I was sexually assaulted a few times when in the first year, and then blamed for it because I'm flirtatious, you know, because like, I am, being flirtatious doesn't mean I'm consenting to sex. Exactly. But people like to conflate that. Or even talking about sex is not consent to have sex.
That's right.
And I like to normalize talking about sex, talking about our bodies, because a lot of the fear of even talking about that makes it even harder to have conversations that really need to be had. So to know what is your boundary and what is not your boundary, and what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, especially if you're young and vulnerable. And so there was just so much I didn't have confidence in or understand without blaming myself. And then, so yeah, I mean, I was absolutely traumatized. I was diagnosed with adjustment disorder after a few years still being there. But even with that, I stayed, you know, and I think that is a testament to how much more I liked it, despite how hard it was.
And were your parents convinced you were lost? Were your parents oh no, the big city, the devil's swallowed her up?
I don't even care. I'm like, it doesn't make, you know what? See, I'm already judging myself based in like Christian values. Okay. So I remember I was in my rebellion stage, And I think I was probably still 19, and I was at the bar, definitely not drinking underage. That was definitely never happened. And I was with 3 guys, and I was flirting with, and I didn't know he had a girlfriend and then I did. And I was like, not good. But I kissed him and I took a picture, and then I kissed his 2 friends and took a picture with that. And then I sent them all to my mom.
Oh, you cheeky thing.
I know. I was like, Mom. And I remember she was like, guess you're not going to church. That was her response, which, I mean, she was right, but
yeah. Wow.
So like that kind of paints the dynamic between me and my mom of that. I was like,
you're not the boss of me.
No, you're not. And what my parents would say is, my house, my rules. And I'm like, okay, I'm paying my own way. So I guess it's my rules now. And so I was very, very like, I'm financially independent. I'm making my own way. I'm paying for my rent. I'm working. Like I'm doing all the things. So I had been financially independent since I was 19 and was very proud of that and attached to that. But yeah, so that's.
When did school start for you then, or post-secondary? I mean, you're working on your PhD now, for Pete's sake, so you have come a long way.
Thank you. Never, ever thought I'd get a PhD. Like that wasn't even, I don't even think I knew what that was, honestly, like until I got to college and a doctor, and I was like, oh, okay, whatever. I'll call them what they tell me to call them, but I didn't really understand what that meant. And I am first generation, so neither of my parents have bachelor degrees. And yeah, I ended up going to 3 schools before getting my bachelor's. And the first, I studied music at all 3 of them. And then at the third one, after getting loans taken out and not knowing what that meant, at 2 private schools, mind you, I finally ended up at a public school in Chicago and was able to get a lot of it funded through kind of a work scholarship. I'm very, as you can see, I love my signature red lip. I love to dress up. And I actually was able to do costume assistance in the theater department to pay my way. I think I got like $9,000 in tuition waiver through that.
Nice.
Yeah, so that was really cool. And I also got into the honors program, which funded some things. So I learned, I'm like, okay, I can't get in more debt, but I would like to further my education. And I do credit, like I went back to school on my own to the second school for theater, but I dropped out. I was in an abusive relationship and ended up just not in a good place. And I then met my current partner who was like, well, I feel like you should go back to school. And I was like, yeah, I would like to. I studied music and I was like, no, I'm going to switch to psychology. I thought about being a therapist and I was like, I think I could be a good therapist. So I went to they had like what you can do with a psychology major workshop or whatever. And I was like, I'm going to do it. So I switched to psychology, and then I took a women gender sexuality studies class. And that professor, Dr. Lori Fuller, was like, you should make this your minor. And I was like, okay.
Oh, nice.
Like very quickly. I know. And then I learned names for what I've experienced, right? Yes. I learned what cultural hegemony is, like the dominant ideology of our culture that's so pervasive that it's invisible. And that's also specifically known as like cultural imperialism. Comes from like Marxism and like those kinds of knowledge. And then the dominant ideology in the US and much of the world being white supremacy culture and what that looks like in terms of it being a capitalist, patriarchal, heteronormative, right? So it's straight, it's white, it's male, it's cisgendered, it's all of these things. It's hierarchical. And I started understanding, and obviously super, super racist. But there's a system in place that perpetuates the sexism, the racism, the classism. And then it just all started kind of going together. And someone I had been friends with showed me a flyer, and it just said like healing from religious harm workshop. And it was a group therapy series. And at the time I was working as a a behavior therapist with children with autism, and I was not very well supported in that job, and I was very stressed, and I missed my pre-interview to see if I would be compatible with the group. So I ended up not getting in the group, and I was really devastated because I hadn't heard of the religious harm or religious trauma, and that was the first time I'd heard of it, and I was like, totally mind blown. And I've seen that happen, and I've talked to people who heard, just hearing religious trauma was like such a validating, cathartic epiphany moment. Like I have chills. It was so powerful. And it's why I've fought so hard. And I keep seeing religious trauma rather than other things. Not that spiritual abuse isn't a valid name for it, right? But for me, that phrase has power, that particular phrase.
Yes.
And so I had the choice of picking a topic for this psychology of women class I was taking. And basically we would write 2 papers on it, and we would have to do an interview, a qualitative interview. And so I interviewed my friend that had shown me the flyer, who grew up Jehovah's Witness, and experienced really shitty things.
Oh gosh.
Is the noise disruptive, or can you not hear it?
No.
Okay, good. Just checking. Okay. So it was, I mean, I don't have to tell you, you flipped it. But like
Jehovah's Witness, very, very high demand group with a lot of trauma.
Yes. So very much. For people that don't know, you're definitely more isolated from the secular world and than like I was in more mainstream Protestant religion. And so she was ostracized from her family. Like she experienced that.
Totally shunned.
Yes. And so the stakes, and people that don't grow up with religion, they don't understand the impact it has. And I'm not saying they can't empathize, but like a lot of academics in particular are just like, I don't really get why religion is so important. And I'm like, have you been to 80% of the country? That's not the cities. Like, because there's absolutely pockets in cities, but like it's almost in small towns, it's everywhere. It's just, it is pervasive. And I mean, I'm talking about the US, but obviously Canada Australia, lots of places in Europe. And then, of course, there's been so much missionary colonization and all over the world. So it's not limited to here by any means. And so I don't remember where I was going with that.
And so then you were looking at, you were in women's studies, and you were also kind of looking at religious harm. In that context.
Right. So I reached out to the counselors, to the therapists that were doing the workshop. And I was like, hey, I'm researching this for my paper. I heard about you from the group, but I wasn't able to be in it. And I was wondering if we could do any collaboration, or if I could talk to you about the work you're doing. And they were like, actually, we have a training coming up for therapists to have like a continuing education unit, right? For healing from religious trauma, for religious harm, for them to be more aware for their clients. And I was like, awesome. And it was like a $50 thing or something. And I was like, it was during my class actually. And I was like, hey, I'm going to go to this training. Is that okay? And she's like, yeah. My husband's like, yeah, pay for it. Sounds awesome. I'm like, cool. So support. We love that. I go to it. Me and like 7 therapists. And I was just like, oh my God, I was nerding out so hard because I've been writing and reading about it. And like obviously Marlene Winnell, reading her work, reading Dr. I think Allison Stone, Thou Shalt Not is a very like popular article. And that's where religious trauma came from, and like removing the syndrome thing. And I get like syndrome is really just means a collection of symptoms, but it has some negative connotation for some people. Right. And for me, I just respect if that's true for people, then that's true for people. And, but I certainly don't think it's meant to be harmful by any stretch of the imagination. But I understand why people feel like things are pathologized.
Yes.
And that's really more to do with, I think, the white supremacy culture and the harm that's been done within institutions like psychology and medical establishments. And pathologizing being weaponized against minorities.
Right.
So there's history there, and I get it. So I do prefer religious trauma, but obviously people have their preferences. And I think there might be some generational divide on that too, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, I mention Dr. Monroe's work because she is a pioneer in the field and a trailblazer as a woman speaking about these things. And someone else who's been important in my life has been Dr. Darrell Ray, and he founded Recovering from Religion, and he wrote a book called The God Virus, which is full of very interesting information. He also wrote Sex and God, but I digress. So you're in school, you started learning about these things, you were really nerding out and recognizing and feeling validated, like, this actually, I can relate to this. This happened in my own life. So do you have a specific definition that you use for religious trauma?
Yes. And also I misspoke. I meant to say Dr. Marlene Winnell. So forgive me for that. We need to correct that stuff. So Dr. Winnell, I am so grateful to Dr. Winnell for the work that she has done, because it is like I said, my Nana being a badass, like Dr. Winnell is a badass. She did pioneer this work, and it's really radical. Like it's still hard to do this work with the culture we live in. It was that much harder in the, I think, 1980s when she really began like publishing on this. Right. So I want to absolutely give credit where credit is due. In terms of a definition, so what I've been running into now that I'm in graduate school, when I've been talking to professors, there's very few people with PhDs doing research on religious trauma. Like Dr. Winnell is one of the very few. And I say that because there's a lot of clinicians doing amazing work, but when it comes to like really honing in on research, there's just almost nothing being done in a way that could elevate the awareness of religious trauma to get more funding, to get more support. So when I was talking with one of my advisors, they pointed out that it's circular, like religious trauma. We talk about that as thinking, okay, this is what I experienced. And another phrase that's become common in this world is adverse religious experiences, or ARE. And so that, I think, is a nice way of thinking of like kind of a unit of, okay, basically amount or exposure to an adverse religious experience may give rise to post-traumatic symptoms, whether acute or complex. And then I go on to like examples of religious trauma or spiritual abuse, because those are pretty much used synonymously in the literature right now, although it needs to be like fine-tuned for sure. But like right now it is being used synonymously. So I can't do everything at once. And I want to obviously read the work that's already been done, but I have to survive my classes first.
That's right.
But examples of religious trauma or spiritual abuse include sexual abuse by religious and spiritual leaders and members, victim blaming around purity and rape culture, excommunication / disfellowshipment / ostracism, because we need different words for different denominations ostracizing people, right?
Right.
And then gender and sex discrimination, conversion therapy. And like, that's not an exhaustive list, but that's some of the most like typical examples.
What about hell? What about raising kids with a fear that they are going to roast in hell?
Yeah. I will add that. I will add that to that. No, absolutely. Which is what I had talked about, but then failed to include, which, I mean, because there is so much that it's easy to forget one. But yeah, that's what I've been working on, like this conceptualization and thinking about religious trauma as a point on a spectrum of harm. So we think about, I feel like sexual harm, we've already done that to some degree of like, you might be uncomfortable, sexually uncomfortable. You might be harassed. You might have been abused. You might have been tortured. Like you might have been killed. Like there's a lot of spectrum of harm, unfortunately, in this world. And I see religious trauma as on the higher end of that spectrum of severity. And I think you can be harassed for your religion. I think there's a lot of things that can happen, but it doesn't necessarily result in trauma, but it of course can. And because there's been so much unwillingness to be critical of religion in the US and in many places of the world, because again, it's the dominant culture. So you're pushing back on the mass, right? On the people in the most power. You're saying, no, that's harmful. And they're like, you're saying I'm harmful? And I'm like, some of your actions are pretty harmful. And so it's an uphill battle. Yeah.
Not even, I mean, I don't want to leave out something that you brought up earlier, the whole aspect of missionary colonization. And because that is, we can't overlook that. It's so tied in and undergirding when we talk about white supremacy and Christianity. Unfortunately, those really are tied together in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And in December, I had the privilege of attending an event at Syracuse University in New York, and it was about the doctrine of discovery, the Catholic doctrine or Christian doctrine of discovery, and the religious roots of white supremacy. And it was just a phenomenal event. I'd love to put you in touch with the folks who put that together. Sandy Bigtree is one of them. It was so mind-blowing to me. And that's just another, when we're talking about trauma from religion or people insisting you must agree to this. You're either going to be sent to hell or cut off from the community or tortured in some way. And even if you do join, there's psychological torture that's going to go on, as you have to live with this constantly invasive notion of there is a God watching you all the time. You have no privacy. You're never free. You're never safe. You're never good enough.
Yeah.
It's a terrible way. It's a terrible way to live. And for children who are brought up in that environment, it's almost impossible, it feels like, to escape. And I know some people, they don't feel they've been harmed by religion. And we know that trauma is subjective. So two people can see a car accident. One is like devastated and the other one just goes on to work and doesn't even think of it again. There are lots of other issues at play around support and what else is going on in your life as to whether that's how your body interprets it. So that also is important to mention. Why do you think, why hasn't religious trauma been studied very much previously? I'm so grateful that this is something that you're actually doing, because we need it. We need it. And it's needed in order for support and for the broader conversation in society, for people to understand, actually, religion's not necessarily benign. It's harmful in a lot of cases.
Right, exactly. And it's that benignness that is so insidious and hard to see. And so I think it's really, really important to name things and to define things and to redefine, which is like self-definition, I think, is a powerful construct used by like Patricia Hill Collins, I believe. Maybe Bell Hooks. I'm forgetting which one. They both do amazing work. But in my time being in my PhD program, I've just finished my first year. And it was incredibly rough. And I think some of the reasons that it was rough for me are indicative of why more work hasn't been done on religious trauma. And so an example of that is I'm often told, because I ended up breaking up with the advisor I came to be here with. She has a need for high control, and I have a need to not be in that environment. Simple way of putting that. And that works for some people. And some people actually need that, crave that. So I'm not saying it's an inherently bad thing, but with my background, it's bad. It was not good for me. So we parted ways, and I am kind of lone wolfing it a little bit. I do have an advisor, but he doesn't do religious trauma. He doesn't look at religion, but he does meta-analyses and health psychology, which is very tied to my interest of health equity. And meta-analyses is essentially a summary of articles and then including statistical analyses as well to see how things compare. And so that's what I'm doing for my master's thesis on religious trauma. And there's really not a lot of research out. And I know that because I've been seeing what articles come out. And I think there might be 8 or 9 that meet my criteria of being empirical. So they did some type of qualitative and or quantitative work. But in the case of a meta-analysis, you have to have some statistics to compare, because a systematic review is a summary without the statistics. Okay. And that's also very valuable. And actually Heidi Ellis, who's a collaborator of NARC-RT, did some of the very first publication. The first systematic review on religious trauma was published, I think, in 2023. And then she just published another thing. And these are based off her dissertation. And I think she got her PhD in counseling psychology recently. So my generation is the one that's going to be, there's going to be a bunch of doctors doing the research. You know what I mean? Yeah. I feel like your generation has a bunch of clinicians doing that work. Yes. And because of your work, we're able to see it. We're seeing the results of naming it, of talking about it. And then we're like, cool, let's like get into that, right? Let's really understand it as best we can and incorporate that within some empirical supported treatments and try to give the best treatment we can and fine tune it, right? And make it more known so that people know that this is even a phenomenon that is occurring in the world. And I'm really wanting to explore yoga therapy and more like mind-body connection with that, because trauma lives in our body and our mind, right?
And even is just new knowledge, like within the last 10 years, kind of the whole idea of, you know, the body keeps the score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. Even the idea of having trauma-informed therapy, that is all new. Like it doesn't, people who, young people, I think maybe don't recognize that it's new, but that is new. Like when Dr. Winnell was doing her work years ago, still the understanding of trauma was still just being gained and collected and those sorts of things. So it is a really important piece about trauma in our bodies and different ways that we can work with clients who have experienced traumatizing situations and what it looks like for them, because it doesn't look the same for everyone, and the same modalities don't work for everyone. So we need to be continually adding to our knowledge base and our therapeutic toolbox for clients.
Yes. And it's interesting because it's hard, from all the people I've talked to who work in research, it's hard to get funding for religious research because they like to, especially in the US, talk about the separation of church and state, which is totally just bullshit. I mean, literally every president has been Christian, or then we have a Catholic and they're like, oh, I'm Catholic. Like, come on. Like, it's not that, it's really like, we've had one non-Christian Protestant, and then we've had one non-white black man, Obama, right? Like, like I'm like if we're looking at the highest levels of power in the country, I think that says a lot about what's still normalized in terms of who should be in power, who should have power, all these things. And so if that's the norm, if that's what's seen as morally good and acceptable, then, you know, it makes sense that the government's not wanting to fund something that would look at that. And I think there's also kind of psychology feeling like, oh, we don't want to be compared to religion and be seen as like an ideology. We want to be seen as a empirical science. Right. And so they're sensitive, and sensitivity can be beautiful, but it can also be hindering. And so there's that. And then there's this new kind of approach, I guess, to research where people think they have to already be an expert in it to have a student studying something. So what I've been told is, well, I don't do religious research. I'm like, okay, but do you research trauma? Like, because you don't have to be an expert in religion. I can consult people who are experts in religion, but there's cultural aspects that you don't have to be able to read in the Hebrew, you know, original text to be able to study religious trauma or to study trauma in certain environments. There's different levels. And that's why I think collaboration between disciplines is so important, as well as community-based participatory research where we're including the people that we're studying and not acting like we're more of an expert on their lives than they are, right? Mm-hmm. It's about meeting them where they're at. What do you need? What can we do to help? Not just, I'm going to get all these publications, but because of how the ivory tower works, you need like 10 publications to get into academia now.
Wow.
And it's part of the gatekeeping that keeps it so white and middle and upper class. Right. And white women are now dominating in psychology, which is interesting. In terms of who's tenured professors, it's still dominated by white men. But they're so isolated from the rest of the world. And a lot of people are out of touch with what it means to be not middle to upper class, to not be white, to not be straight. Right. And it's interesting because there are less Christians in academia. So there's even less interest in like studying it because, well, that doesn't affect me. And they don't. So that's the other thing. So there's a lot there. And I'm sure there's more. And some people might really disagree with some of my perspectives, but hey, that's why we're here, right? Like arguing to enhance science and knowledge. And
yeah, beautiful. I hadn't considered some of those things myself. And I really feel like as a Canadian, as a white Canadian middle-aged woman, I didn't even really start to recognize my own issues around racism until I was well into my 40s. And so I grew up in a white evangelical family. And then my parents brought in my foster sister, who's First Nations. And that was part of the tail end of the 60s scoop in Canada, where RCMP and social workers were actively going on to reserves and stealing essentially Indigenous children and placing them in white Christian families. I got my air quotes for the kids' safety, for the children's safety, right? Yeah. And so I thought, I'm not racist. I have a Native sister. That's how I thought when I grew up, and she took our last name and we went to school together and all this kind of thing. And it wasn't till I was in my 40s when I started studying psychology and wanted to become a counselor that I started gaining understanding of the residential schooling, which was so horrendous and entirely perpetrated by the Church, Catholic Church, United Church, Anglican Church. They were all in cahoots, but largely the Roman Catholic Church and the Canadian government, which of course was white and male also. And I never had really stopped to think about that. In some ways, I'm part of the problem. Like I have to recognize my own thinking and my own privilege. And that is something that's starting to happen in Canada now since the horrifying, very, very sad discovery of the unmarked graves at our residential schools across Canada. So I feel like Canadians are starting to wake up to some of these things, but my gosh, we have got such a long way to go.
And the U.S. is not even willing to fund excavation to try to see what harm has been done, right? Like not, at least not comparatively that I know of. And I mean, there's so much work to do, but I like you're saying, the acknowledgement, because I also have to decolonize my way of thinking. And that takes a lot of effort and work. But I think especially as a white person, that white people need to do more of that work and teaching other white people what that looks like. Right. And even like me not calling Dr. Winnell, that was a microaggression. And I'm like, I need to fix that. Right. And so that's why I wanted to name it rather than even cut it out. I'm like, no, I messed up. Let's acknowledge that and then move on and fix the behavior. Right. And I think that is a really valuable thing to learn, is to just like, okay, like, thank you for a correction, and I corrected myself in this case. Well, you actually did, but in a very gentle way. You were like, yes, Dr. Winnell. And I'm like, yes, Dr. Winnell. So thank you. But the like microaggressions are one example. And I think like of obviously like things that are not as, I don't even know, severe, but still have a accumulation effect that can be really severe, right? Similar to religious trauma and like accumulation of hurt. What was I going to say? I was going to say, I will, one thing that about RTSA, religious trauma, spiritual abuse, is that the way the DSM and the ICD frames trauma is still very much physical. And that needs to be worked on. And so that was a lot of the feedback I've gotten is like, okay, but the way you're defining this doesn't fit DSM. And I'm like, so what? Should it, I mean, it could be better. But then I also learned that DSM is basically a joke and people, they just slept. And I was like, what? But they're like, oh, but we don't want to, we don't want to invalidate our own profession. Okay, but we can make it better if we acknowledge what's not working. But they're so scared to do that. And it's like, so I'm just like, nah, to do. I'm going to name it.
Yeah. Good for you. I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you are doing this work. And I'm really grateful that you took the time out of your busy schedule to meet with me today. Let's stay in touch because I would love to have you back again as you continue your studies. And you're so much fun and you're just like a shooting star. I'm going to definitely keep my eyes on you. We're pretty much at the end of our time. Is there a way that people can contact you or reach out to you?
Absolutely. So the www.NARC-RT.org is our website for the nonprofit that I co-founded. And there's a contact form there. So that's a really great way to get in touch. And you can see other amazing people's work like yours. I have your mention of your podcast on the resources and other amazing organizations like the Reclamation Collective. I think I put Dr. Darway, on there as well. I'll have to double check. But like, Janice, you're so brilliant. Seriously. I'm like,
oh my gosh. No one's ever called me brilliant before.
You are. I mean, I love the way you think. I love talking to you. You're so good at it. I love your podcast. So thank you so much for this relationship. I'm really grateful.
Wonderful. It's been a real pleasure talking with you today. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in and we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.